we did a verse of Tehillim 119, of Psalm 119, and we started with the first verse last week. And the entire chapter, speaks about Torah study and keeping the commandments and David's love of the commandments. It's really just it's a very long chapter. Just looking to see how many verses it has. It has more verses than Psalms has chapters. Okay, there are a lot of verses. I'm trying to get to the end here. To get to 200, there's 186 verses in this chapter. Okay, so it's like a mini book of Tehillim, a mini book of Psalms on its own. That's how long it is. But the verses themselves are actually quite short. Each verse is relatively short, Anyway, so we're going to talk about verse 2 today. The first two verses starts with the words praiseworthy and fortunate, depending on, those are the two definitions. The words ashrei. Ashrei can mean, often translated praiseworthy, and I see that the commentaries do say that. In the Metzudah Tzion, the Metzudah Tzion says that it refers to praise and appreciation of this type of person. Okay, so the second verse says, verse 2 says, praiseworthy or happy is the person who keeps and guards his testimonies. With all his heart does he seek them out. I'm looking in the Hebrew and translating straight from Hebrew. So I don't know what it says in your versions, but it should be pretty much that way. If your Psalms doesn't say something like that, you're probably not looking at a Hebrew. You're not looking at a Hebrew translation. I don't know what you're looking at. But anyway, again, so verse 2 says, fortunate are those who guard and keep my his testimonies. With all their heart do they seek them out. That's the second verse. So the commentaries explain that the word testimonies refers to a certain type of commandment, certain type of mitzvah. As you can plainly understand, a testimony represents what? Bearing witness to something. So in other words, doing acts that reflect that what you're doing is testifying to something about God. What is that? So they explain that it's things that testify to the world, the creation of the world, basically, the act of creation. And also, the Malbim says, so that's in the Metzudah Tzion, and the Malbim says that it's things that testify that God created the world and renewed it and brought it into being, and that he rewards and punishes and also interferes in nature. And he says this is basically learned from the book of Genesis, story of Adam and the generations up until the Exodus from Egypt. All those stories are stories of, what happens to those who act in a way that's immoral, that's against God's law and against God's wishes or God's will, and act with wickedness, and what happens to them, right? And it's also the stories. Now, when the Malbim says that up until the Exodus, I don't know if he's including the Exodus or just until there, because in terms of the idea of interfering with nature, really the best example of that is the going out of Egypt. I think he's including it because, most of the commandments that refer to Israel have to do with the going out of Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt. The Exodus from Egypt, for example, like Passover, is both a testimony to those miracles, but it also ends up being a testimony to God's the creator of the world and is in control of nature and can suspend the nature whenever he feels like. He can suspend the laws of nature. And that's what that teaches us. So the question is, how does that relate to a Ben Noach, a Noahide? Since a Noahide doesn't have to keep the Sabbath or the other or any of the festivals, and they're not really directed to the Ben Noach. So in that case, does this have any application to you? Is there any such a thing as a testimony for a Ben Noach? So I think we just need to think of this. Something I'm just thinking about. So, I mean, the simple answer might be no, but the more complex answer is yes, meaning on a deeper level. So on a surface level, no, there's no mitzvah there's no of the 7 laws of the 7 mitzvahs. We don't see any of them that are a testimony. But if you take it a step deeper, I think you can say there are certain of the 7 laws that represent testimony. Obviously, the law in not worshiping idolatry. Obviously, if a person has faith in God and rejects idolatry, then and person prays to God, then that represents the idea of the belief that God is the creator and is in control. I mean, that's quite obvious. But there are some other things which I was thinking of that bear a relationship to this commandment, at least in an indirect way. So first of all, the prohibition against adultery. So one of the reasons for that, right, is, and when I say adultery, it's not just adultery, but it's also, and even maybe more so, incest and things like that, right? So I was thinking that particularly that part of sexual prohibitions that relate to sexuality outside of the species would relate to the idea of giving a testimony to God, because basically the person is doing is one of the reasons for guarding this behavior is because God created all the different animals and all the creatures, different species, and to honor and respect that by remaining within species, remaining within, and similarly, you can even say, maybe taking that a bit further, so maybe even the rejection of different incestuous relationships also represents that idea of the person seeking to fulfill God's will in terms of the perpetuation of the species and how that should take place. And that represents the idea that I know God is the creator and this world is his, and there's certain laws that that he imprinted into creation, and I want to try to follow that. Similarly, the law about not eating the limb of a living animal, we spoke about a long time ago, and we touch on it from time to time, also includes not causing unnecessary pain to an animal. It's an outgrowth of that mitzvah. Again, this also touches on whether we're baseline Noahide law or whether it's a more extensive and there's offshoots. But everyone agrees that there are offshoots, and certainly anything that's rationally related, even if it's not directly forbidden, but should be understood and should be avoided. So we've often mentioned that destruction of natural resources for no reason and giving animals pains are things that Noah should stay away from, and that they're offshoots of the prohibition against eating the limb of a living animal, which is definitely prohibited, and have to be careful about that, which is a little bit of a topic for another time. And so that's another way in which a Noahide can bear testimony that God created the world, because by respecting nature, that shows that you recognize that it's not just something random that's just there and therefore you can exploit it as you wish, but that is created by God and it's his handiwork and really his possession. So that's another way in which we can that B'nai Noach could form a mitzvah that testifies to God being the creator. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. So then there's another point here in this verse. So that's the first part, is to guard God's testimonies, which it does seem that the simple interpretation means that the children of Israel should guard those laws related to the Sabbath and festivals. That would be the simple translation. But again, it also includes other things, as we just mentioned. And then at the end of the verse says, with all his heart, without all his or her heart, as you seek them out, it's understood by some of the commentaries that this is goes back on the beginning of the verse, that when is a person praiseworthy for keeping these statutes, these testimonies, is when he seeks them out with all his heart. Meaning to say, according to the Malbim, that this means that the person's performance of the testimonies that represent bearing testimony to God being the creator should be done completely faithfully, with complete belief, without any doubt as to God being the creator. And it seems like that the Malbim refers to the philosophers. I guess this was a big topic in his day, and that he says that the philosophers, they have doubts, they're not sure, they hem and haw back and forth as far as God's creator. But we have faith, and therefore we cannot be shaken. We have faith. We have we've received this Masorah in Hebrew. I'm trying to think of the proper English word for that, but it's been handed down from us, testimony from generation to generation, and so we have no question about it. We're not shaky like the philosophers. This is an amazing way to start our next topic, which is going to the duties of the heart, because this comment is very much related to that study. So anyway, that's the end of this verse. That's the end of our section on Psalms for today. So just to repeat, the verse is saying praiseworthy are those that keep God's testimonies, his testimonies meaning God's testimonies, and with all their hearts, meaning with a complete heart, do they seek them out, meaning to say, according to the Malbim, that they keep these testimonies with a full heart, without doubt, and this is because it's based on faith, and it's based on what's been handed down from generation to generation. That's according to the Malbim.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The second word in that verse, you translated that as guard. How is that different than shmar?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. They're used slightly interchangeably. I have to look around. I don't have an answer for that offhand. In other words, why do we use one word instead of the other one? When I look into what's called the Metzudas Sion, he exactly says that. He says notzre, and he defines it shomre. So he basically is saying they're identical.
Okay.
I mean, there must be some difference, but if there is, it's very subtle.
Okay. It's a new word for me.
Yeah. Any other questions on that? What's funny is you can actually look at this verse, particularly the end of it, and say just the opposite of what the Malbim is saying here. And I think that our author would say kind of the opposite. I have a feeling this verse is mentioned somewhere. And I need to say the author of Duties of the Heart, Rabbeinu Bachya, I have a feeling that he understands it completely differently, because the end of the verse here in Psalm 119, verse 2, it ends with the words, with all his heart does he seek them out. So he's seeking it. Now, seeking, I mean, when you receive something from your parents, and you accept that as tradition, you don't have to seek it out, do you? You're seeking it when you're trying to think about it, or meditating about it, and investigating about it, right? So you can really say just the opposite. I mean, he seems to be learning with all your heart, meaning in simplicity and in purity, but you can really say just the opposite. With all your heart, meaning with all your strength and your emotion, your energy, the person is seeking. So in other words, he's trying to understand it as deeply. He's trying to understand the fact that God's the creator in a deep way. So that means that the person is not just accepting tradition, but examining the creation and trying to find proofs of God, in the creation, actually. He's seeking for it to penetrate his heart deeper by taking it into his own hands. And I think that's the way our author would understand this verse, because our author, meaning to say that the author of Duties of the Heart, is a very big proponent of meditating, on God and his attributes and God being the creator. He's not in favor of a person just accepting it alone. He believes that you also have to deeply investigate and think about it. Someone else, a towering giant, another towering giant of Judaism that has that view, the Rambam, Maimonides. He says in the laws of the foundational principles of Torah, the first section of his monumental work, the Mishnah Torah, he says you come to knowing God through the creation and through science and through study, but obviously just with that alone isn't enough. But the point is using that to then deduce backwards. Wow, look at how this unbelievable wisdom in creation, and so God is this amazing. He's so wise, there's so much intellect, there's so much beauty, and taking the step back. So that's Maimonides' view. So both of them is b'chol lev yidrushuhu, with all your heart, with all his heart, he seeks them out. Is the point? No, he's investigating deeply. Just the opposite. So I think this one verse can go in two diametrically opposed ways, so to speak, to understand the end of the verse. Any questions on this? Okay, so just to be clear, our approach is we need both. And actually, Rabbeinu Batya agrees with that. You have to have tradition. First of all, because the human mind is faulty, and sometimes we come to bad conclusions. Okay, so you have to have tradition. But at the same time, we have to make it our own. We all know that it's kind of like being a teenager. Your parents tell you things, and you're like, I don't know if that's true. I'm going to find out for myself, right? But we're all like that. We still have a little bit in that we have to really know and ourselves. Okay, so now we're going to go to Duties of the Heart, exactly that point. And I also want to say something about this whole study of Duties of the Heart that I was thinking about that's important. And that is that what is the point what is this all about? I mean, what are we getting to with, because you may start to notice something about this book that it's very rational. I mentioned it last time. It's in a certain, I mean, I don't know if I should use the word cold, but it's certainly not poetic. It doesn't address emotion very much. I shouldn't say that. He addresses emotion, but in a rational way. So in other words, the vehicle, it doesn't pull our, how do you say, it doesn't, I forget the expression for that, but the chords of our heart, what is that expression? It doesn't touch us it's not trying to pull our heartstrings. That's the expression, right? That's not what this book is doing. It's supposed to be very rational and methodical. So the question is, if the book is trying to get people to serve God in an inner way, which means love and fear, how can you really get that through cold reason? What is his point really? So you can't say, no, his point is just you should be a deep thinker about God. That's one approach, but it's going to be clear that that's not the case. So, and the truth is, this is a bit of the Chabad approach also. It seems that what the author wants you to do, and this really is an important approach in Judaism, he wants you to meditate on these ideas deeply that he's going to discuss, even though they're rational and very methodical. And, you may say cold, although I won't necessarily agree with that. But certainly they're not, it's not an emotional vehicle. So what are you doing with it? You're meditating on it until you get to the point where this is a truth of yours, and then it shakes you. In other words, he wants you to think about these things so deeply that you actually do feel different about these things. That's what he must want us to do, because it's really he's talking about an inner life. So it's not just it's not logic games that we're doing here, right? Okay. Any questions or comments about this so far? So in other words, if for an exercise, those of you who want to do extra credit, when we read a section, you should go over it and think about it deeply and read it a few times. And then you'll get different ideas. One of the one of the biggest reasons the world things are the way they are and different and have veered off from a God conscious world is because we just are not conscious about it, because we don't think about it. We're not looking at the world from God's vantage point. We're not thinking, what does God want? Who is he? We're not thinking about him, and therefore we're not responding. We're just thinking, people are just thinking about what they need physically and their own needs, or even their own relationships with other human beings. And they're not thinking about things from, okay, there's a God, and what is he about? Who is he? What is he? And what does he want from me? Why am I here? And these questions, if they're thought about regularly, lead us in a very different direction. So that's what he wants to do. And without doing that, well, then we're just in the rat race with everybody else. So it's really important. So that's why this book is really, really important for all of us. Okay, so I am on page, I think was on page 4. And we try, I don't know if we got to the bottom of the page yet. I'm going to start over a little bit. I'll start from page, actually in English it's page 5. Page 5, and I'll start from the second paragraph, meaning the paragraph that begins on page 5. I guess before I do that, I should introduce what we're in the middle of saying over here. So we're in the middle of talking about how human beings were bestowed by God, the ability, intellect, and different forms of wisdom they've been gifted. In other words, basically, he's saying that human beings have had the opportunity and the merit and the unique privilege of being bestowed with the intellect and the discovery through their intellect of these different forms of sciences. He calls them all sciences, which is very interesting. And he says these sciences help people in 2 ways. They help the person in terms of navigating the physical world, and they also help a person in order to know the Torah. And then he breaks down these forms of wisdom that God has bestowed on man, human beings, in 3 parts, into 3 categories. One is the natural sciences. The 2 is mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and I guess today you could probably include physics, right? So the more abstract sciences. He also includes music, and that's interesting. I guess that's because it's based on notes and things like that. Number three is theology, which is the knowledge of God. May he be exalted. And the knowledge of his Torah, as well as other subjects understood by the intellect, such as the soul, the intellect, and spiritual beings. So that's the mystical. So there's the knowledge of God, knowledge of the Torah, and knowledge of, mystical things like the soul and other spiritual beings. Okay. So that's things that maybe the Zohar talks about and things like that. So, all right. So now we can begin. I'm now on page 5, second paragraph. These fields of study with their various divisions are gates opened for man by the Creator, may he be exalted, in which one can come to understand the Torah and the world. So these things have been gifted to man by the Creator so that he can understand the world around him, right? And the Torah, of course. Some of these sciences are more vital for understanding the Torah, whereas others are more vital for worldly uses. But these are the two categories of things that a person needs. Now, one of them is intrinsically valuable, and one of them is more ancillary. In other words, it's something we need to have for utilitarian purposes, but may not have as much intrinsic value on its own, right? So those which are more vital for worldly matters are the lower science, natural science, and the intermediate science and mathematics. These two sciences teach us of all the secrets of this world, of its uses and benefits, and that we may gain from it, as well as the different skills and crafts which are necessary for meeting physical needs and for the acquisition of various worldly goods. So, so even in this discussion, as he's laying down for you different types of wisdom, he's also bringing it back to a gratefulness and recognition of God's place within that. That these forms of knowledge themselves are a gift, and they're from God too. And the reason people have knowledge of these things is because that's a special favor and grace that God has given and done, that people have this knowledge. It's not automatic, right? And the reason is that, what's amazing and wonderful about this, and such a tremendous blessing, is that these sciences give people tremendous benefits, as we see basically all around. Right now, we're making use of it. The miracle that human beings are able to figure out how to communicate with each other and see each other, 1,000 miles away from each other. That's amazing. It's incredible. And that is something that God has given man the ability to do. Or maybe it's taken generations and building one principle, scientific one on top of another, until they put different scientific principles together and came up with this contraption we're using right now. That's unbelievable. So it really is quite amazing. And this is really important what he's doing for our character and for the rest of the discussion in this book, because it's a topic discussed particularly in Kabbalistic sources, but in ethical sources also, is that knowledge and intellect is a problem. Why is it a problem? It's a problem because it causes arrogance, and it also causes people to sometimes to rebel, sort of, or to certainly to trying to think of the right word, but to distance themselves, or I'm trying to think of the right word, but they're less listeners than followers. In other words, they don't follow and listen to God's will as much, because suddenly they're smarty pants. They know better. They have their own way of thinking. And in other words, what I'm trying to say is intellect sometimes can be the enemy of piety. This isn't anything really new. Scholars and pietists often clashed. And often the example of someone pious is maybe a simple Jew saying Psalms, or fasting, and the scholar is studying Talmud. So they're often different personalities, and he wants you to understand that knowledge and intellect comes from God, so that the person should remain humble, and that their knowledge shouldn't act as a means of propelling them away from God, so to speak. So they're both propelled but yet distant, and that's a problem. And it could create a very big problem. Person doesn't want to end up like Yerabim ben Nevat. Doesn't want to end up, I don't know the English translation for that, but that is the famous king who led Israel, the 10 tribes, astray. He actually he had a high soul and was a very intelligent person. He may have been a great Torah scholar. I mean, the Talmud tells us a story that God communicated with him, appeared to him, and asked him to repent. I mean, I don't know if this is a literal, that he had a prophecy, or it was a divine inspiration that he sensed. It's unclear. But the point is, the Midrash in the Talmud, the Agada of the Talmud tells us that God said to him, repent, and you and I and the son of Jesse will walk together in the Garden of Eden. So he asked the question, I think this is in Tractate Sanhedrin. He says, who's going to be first, me or the son of Jesse, meaning David, King David? And then God said, no, King David, he's going to be first. He said, if so, I don't need it. Then I don't. So in other words, his arrogance was so bad. He had such tremendous spiritual potential. But when he heard that, he was in such a competition with David and his descendants, when he was told that David would be ahead of him, then it wasn't worth it. Then he wasn't going to repent. I mean, there may even be much deeper levels of exactly why he rejected it. He may have had, some type of theological justifications. But anyway, my purpose of this is really just as an example, and I don't want to get any more off track than I've already gotten off track, to say that again, there's a conflict between intellect and piety, and following God's will. And so by introducing wisdom and intellect as being a gift of God, and us recognizing that as a way of avoiding that conflict and that test, that enticement for a person to become pretentious, for a person to begin to have an attitude because they're smart and they know it. And so that's what he's doing here. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. Next paragraph. But the field of study which is essential to the Torah is the most lofty of all sciences, namely theology. And it is our duty to learn this wisdom in order to understand and realize the Torah. So we have to know godly wisdom in order to understand and fulfill the Torah. To study it in order to attain worldly benefit, however, is forbidden. So the whole purpose of studying theology, meaning to study the knowledge of understanding God, the purpose is to follow. So this is another extremely important point he's making here. So before we begin to study, we have to know why we're studying. We are studying in order to add in our fear and love of God, in order to enhance our performance of the mitzvahs, in order to enhance our performance and keeping and observance of the commandments. That's the point of this study. It's not for any other reason. In fact, to do it for worldly benefit is forbidden. Okay. Any questions so far? That's also clearly the reason why, studying of the Zohar is taken as something that should be done only by someone who's very knowledgeable in Jewish law, because that reflects, that the person is serious about keeping the law, right? Before he studies about God and God and godly secrets. So, I mean, look, when you enter God's chamber, into God's throne room, so to speak, you have to enter with a point to your purpose needs to be to serve the king and to work on behalf of the kingdom, not to just, gain something from it. That's very improper and, disrespectful, and could be, if the king finds out about it, you're in trouble, right? And obviously here the king will find out about it. Okay. So next paragraph, I'm up to the paragraph where it states it was taught on page 5. It's about 2/3 of the way to the bottom of the page. It was taught, meaning to say, it says in a verse in the Torah, to love Hashem your God, to obey his voice, and to attach yourself to him. So in other words, what's the point? The point of to know these things is in order to love Hashem, to obey his voice, and to attach yourself to God. This means that a person should not say, I will study so as to be called a scholar. I will learn so as to be called rabbi. I will learn in order to be one of the authorities in the academy. Rather, learn out of love, and in the end, honor will come. So this is actually, a statement of our sages. That why should a person study Torah? Why should a person study theology? Not for personal gain, but for its own sake, for the sake of fulfilling the Torah and serving God. Okay. Carry out the words of the Torah for the sake of the deed. Study them for their own sake, and do not make them a crown to win fame with or an axe to cut with. So it's forbidden to use the Torah to win fame or to utilize it for any other need. For example, to gain some type of compensation because of it, or something like that, to gain favors from people, anything like that. You're not allowed to do that. So the question is, if that's the case, how can a rabbi get paid for teaching? Or how can a teacher get paid for being a teacher? So the answer is you're not studying and teaching because you want the money. It's just that you're using your time, and so that's time you could spend working. So point is, a person, in other words, the rabbi is getting paid because you need to get paid to live. And he wants to dedicate his life to teaching and spreading the Torah and strengthening people spiritually, but he's got to get paid, otherwise he can't do it. So in other words, if he accepts the payment, he's not studying in order to get the payment, but he needs to know that he gets the payment in order that he can teach. Does that make sense? It can't be the goal of the teaching, can't be to get the money. The goal of teaching, because that's his passion. But of course, he has to get paid because he has to pay his bills and he has to have a family and so on. Okay. So in any event, but the point is that it's forbidden to use the Torah, to utilize it to gain something from it. And that's in the Talmud and Tractate Nedarim, folio 62, side A. Any questions on this so far? We're almost at the end of our session. Maybe we'll stop over here. Let's see how much more we have. Well, no, let's learn one more paragraph and we'll stop there. Happy is the man who fears God, who takes great delight in his commandments. It says in Psalms chapter 112, said Rabbi Elazar, in his commandments and not in the reward of his commandments. As we have learned, be not like servants who serve the master on condition of receiving a reward, but be like servants who serve the master not on condition of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. That's actually already on page 7. So look at this. Not only are you not supposed to fulfill the commandments and study Torah to gain physical gain, monetary gain or fame or social advantages, but even for the sake of the reward itself, like in the Garden of Eden, etc., even that you shouldn't do. You should perform them for their own sake, just because of the meaning and because you love to do that, you love to fulfill God's will. That's why a person should take delight in the commandments themselves intrinsically. Well, that would mean that the person has the ability to do that. And where would that come from? That would have to come from the godliness in their soul that takes a delight in just being intimate with God, which is what happens when a person performs a mitzvah, is they become close to God, and that itself, that experience is enough. And they're fulfilling the commandments for their own sake because they want to do it. Any questions on this so far? He's basically saying that he's committed the past few paragraphs to explain that the study of theology, the study of God, understanding God to whatever degree a human being can, needs to be done for the purpose of strengthening love and fear of God in order to serve God better, but not just as a curiosity or to build a reputation or to somehow gain any type of other benefit from it. Even if it's reward in the world to come, even that is not really praiseworthy, but should be done for its own sake. Any questions so far? It's a bit of a high level. The question arises, if you're not on that level and you want to learn it to gain the reward, is that okay? I think it is okay. Interestingly enough, he doesn't mention it here, but the Talmud also says that if a person is permitted to study Torah not for its own sake, because studying Torah not for its own sake leads to studying it for its own sake. So it's not where we want you to be, but it's a starting point. Now, by the way, the question is, learning for ulterior motives may be different than not learning for its own sake. In other words, learning for a spiritual reward may be permitted. Learning because you're expected to by others in the community, but could be that completely ulterior, meaning for fame or to somehow gain some advantage, that might be forbidden altogether. Particularly because Rabbi Akiva says someone who uses the Torah will pass away from the world, which implies a punishment for misusing the Torah, a harsh punishment. So that implies that utilizing it and intending to utilize it like as some way to make as a business or to gain fame or a connection is outright forbidden. And it seems like this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Okay, questions or comments, because we're going to stop here.